Today we are interviewing Noam Chomsky, the Institute Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. Professor Chomsky is to modern linguistics what Freud is to modern psychology and Einstein is to modern physics. Professor Chomsky is also known for his works on U.S. foreign and domestic policies and has over 50 books published, the latest of which is Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. According to the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, between 1980 and 1992, Professor Chomsky was cited as a source more often than any other living scholar, and the 8th most cited scholar overall. Professor Chomsky was voted the leading living public intellectual in the 2005 Global Intellectuals poll conducted by the British magazine Prospect. When asked about receiving the award, he stated, "I don't pay a lot of attention to polls." When he was once asked on the discussion boards at ZNet how he felt about receiving so much public attention, he responded that the only person he thinks deserves a lot of attention is his new granddaughter. It's Chomsky the man, the good-hearted, sincere, and decent human being that I have come to appreciate and love. I'm so glad we have you on the show with us today, Professor Chomsky. Welcome.
Really glad to be with you.
Today we'll be talking about corporations. Over half of the Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware, and the interests of corporations dominate much of Delaware's politics and culture, as they do elsewhere in the world. Asking our first question is Ellen Leibowitz.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. It's an honor to be able to talk with you. You've called corporations unaccountable tyrannies. In what way are corporations tyrannical and unaccountable, and how do those characteristics of corporations manifest themselves in U.S. policy, U.S. domestic and foreign policy?
Well, if you look at the internal structure of a corporation, it's about as close to the totalitarian ideal as anything that humans have ever constructed. So it's a system of power. The power is centralized at the top. At the very top, if you think of it in political terms, the very top it holds both judicial, executive, and legislative power. That's vested in the board of directors and the CEO. All that power. They make decisions. They transfer the decisions down to the next lower levels. If you're, say, a junior manager, you receive orders from above. You transmit them to whoever is below you. At the very bottom of the system, there are people who are allowed to rent themselves to the corporation. They're called the workforce. They have no say in what goes on, no authority, and so on. There are stockholders, but that's who technically have a voice, and to a limited extent do, but it's a very marginal matter. For one thing, stockholding is extremely concentrated. Stock ownership, probably top 1% of the population holds about half the stock. The corporations are closely interlinked, so you get the same, big banks and so on the boards of managers. They interact in all kinds of ways. So internally, they're just an extreme form of tyranny, and they're unaccountable to the public except by regulatory mechanisms. Well, the regulatory mechanisms are weak and often not applied, and the reason they're weak is because the corporate system, which concentrates most of the wealth of the country and the power of the country in its hands, also, to an overwhelming extent, dominates the state, very closely linked to the state. The state is largely staffed by representatives of major corporations, or often the few major law firms that cater to corporate interests. The Secretary of State can be from one of the big corporate law firms. It's not going to be a public interest lawyer or a civil rights lawyer. And there have been studies, and they simply show, academic studies, they just show the obvious, that the major external influence on government is business, which means corporate sector, and that the next major influence is what are called experts, who usually have tight links to the same sector. This goes on and on. So they are tyrannies, and they're basically unaccountable. As to the influence they have over the society, it's almost impossible to answer. They essentially own the society. They determine what's produced, what's distributed. They overwhelmingly control the means of communication and information, which they use to carry out what they sometimes called fabrication of consumers, inventing created wants, trying to control attitudes and opinions to ensure their free actions in their own interest in the domestic scene and internationally. So they have inordinate control over society, and they're mostly unaccountable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the description is it's not my description, incidentally. It's kind of conventional. You look back at the sort of classic works on structure of business, it's pretty much what they say. And because it's pretty obvious.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell you, I just viewed the movie The Corporation, which you were part of, and I would recommend it so very highly for all of our listeners to really get a grasp on what you have been talking about and what you will continue to talk about throughout the interview. But it's a stunning movie, and I want to thank you for being part of that. It was wonderful.
If I can add something, I'd also suggest reading the book that it's based on. It's based on a book called The Corporation by a Canadian a legal specialist, a lawyer who specializes in corporate law and so on. A very good book. Joel Bakan is his name, B-A-K-A-N. Very readable, too.
Thank you. That's great. Well, our next question will be asked by Marian Pileski. Marian?
Professor Chomsky, in the U.S., corporations are considered legal persons holding almost the same rights as citizens. You have stated that ascribing personhood to corporations is folly and dangerous. Why is it foolish and dangerous, and why do you believe in abolishing legal personhood for corporations?
Well, actually, their rights go way beyond that of persons. There are steps towards this in the 19th century, but it was in the early 20th century when the courts, not legislation, determined that corporations, which are just what the legal literature calls collectivist legal entities, that corporations should have the rights of persons of flesh and blood, at least a lot of the rights, which was a major attack on classical liberal principles, on what's called conservatism. Now, back in those days, there were conservatives, and nowadays there are people who call themselves conservatives, but has nothing to do with traditional conservatism. Traditional conservatives, who were classical liberals, were outraged at the idea that collectivist entities should be given the rights of persons of flesh and blood. I mean, the whole liberal tradition, as the Enlightenment tradition, is based on the idea that rights are invested in persons and human beings, not on collectivist entities. And they described it, in fact, as a return to feudalism and a form of communism, which is not incorrect. It is a return to something like the system of medieval feudal guilds, where control over some sector of the economy and social life was in the hands of a private guild. Well, that's what this is. Corporate rights were then extended very substantially, even as late as the 1970s, the courts were granting new rights to corporations, extending to them rights of freedom of speech, extending that notion of freedom of speech to freedom to spend money, like fund political campaigns, which is grotesque, and rights of freedom from search and seizure, so they can't be investigated, just like the police can't go into your home. You can't investigate what's going on in the interior to these huge private tyrannies. Of course, they're massive. But to compare with them with persons is ridiculous. I mean, General Motors or General Electric is not the same as a person. And it continues. The trade agreements that underlie the World Trade Organization or NAFTA, they grant corporations rights that go vastly beyond persons. Mm-hmm. So if, say, General Motors invests in Mexico, they, under these agreements, they can demand what's called national treatment. They have to be treated like a Mexican company, like a mom and pop grocery store in Mexico. Well, you know who's going to win that competition. On the other hand, if a Mexican, flesh and blood Mexican, comes to, say, New York and demands national treatment, well, he'll be lucky if he doesn't end up in Guantanamo. Not going to get very far. Those are rights that go. Also, corporations by these agreements are given the rights to sue governments, take lawsuits against governments. You and I can't do that. And some of these suits under these agreements allow them to claim to sue governments for actions that are called tantamount to expropriation. Mm-hmm. That's a vast expansion of the takings clause of the Bill of Rights. Yeah. Tantamount to expropriation means any act taken by a community or a government that might infringe on potential profits of the corporation are subject to legal suit. I mean, no human being can do anything like that.
Even if it's devastating to the environment in that community.
Environment and everything else.
Yeah, they usurp all those
and it's devastating just elementary human rights. Yeah. It means that communities can't decide what they want to happen in their community because that would infringe on the potential profits of some tyrannical monster that utterly overwhelms the community in scale and power. In fact, as pointed out in that film that you saw in Joel Bakan's book, the courts also determined that corporations not only are legally persons, but that they are required to be the kind of persons who we would put into a mental institution or a jail if they were flesh and blood. They have to be pathological. The courts determined that corporations must single-mindedly pursue power, profit, market share. They cannot do anything decent. That's a crime. There's a qualification. They're allowed to do something decent and humane if the TV cameras are running. That is, if you can use it to build up your image so as to increase your power. So if a drug company wants to, say, give out drugs in a poor community, they can do it as long as it contributes to their image. But they can't do it the way a human being would because you want to be benign. That's illegal.
I'm sorry, I just had a question. How does Ray Anderson then fit into this with his company Interface? I mean, obviously he's trying to create a sustainable corporation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that was a privately owned company, as I recall. So he has check back, but I think he has no responsibility to his shareholders. Also, if you look back at the film, he was surely a nice guy and probably doing the right thing, but he was saying that increases, it's good for sales.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if he was doing it in a way which would harm shareholders' profit, they could bring him to court. And in fact, did. That's the famous Dodge versus Ford case about 90 years ago, in which Henry Ford, who owned ran the Ford Motor Company, largely owned it, tried to produce cheap, serviceable cars and to pay what were, by the standards of the time, decent wages. He was sued by some of the stockholders, the Dodge brothers, who said that by doing that he was infringing on their profits. That went to court, and the Dodge brothers won.
Wow.
Ford was not allowed to produce decent cars with decent wages, and the Dodge brothers used their the compensation that they won for the case to establish the Dodge Motor Company. Chrysler and so on.
Professor Chomsky, we had a person in here last week on the program who was talking about healthcare, and he said...
Could you talk a little louder? I can't quite hear.
I'm sorry. Yes, we had a person in here last week who was talking about health insurance companies, and he said that when you really think about why do health insurance companies need to have commercials on television, because most everybody, you work for a business and you have 2 or 3 plans to choose from if you're lucky to have that. And so there's really not a choice that you can make. And his belief was that the reason why there are commercials for health insurance companies is because health insurance companies want to give the corporate media a vested interest in not talking about them and talking about how the healthcare system in the United States of America is leaving a lot of people without any kind of coverage, and also the other kinds of problems, the waste, the fraud, and so on that associated with healthcare. Do you think there's some truth to that?
It's possible that there's an element of truth to that. I mean, it's worth remembering that there's sort of a deeper question. Why should there be healthcare companies altogether?
Yes.
The public doesn't want it.
Mm-hmm.
The public large majorities of the public are in favor of some kind of national healthcare system. It's just that the power of private power is so enormous that the public will cannot be satisfied.
Right.
So, for example, when occasionally the press will mention the fact that there's a large majorities of the public in favor of public health care, national health care, it's described as politically impossible or lacking political support, which means that the insurance companies and the financial institutions and Wall Street, the HMOs, won't allow it.
Don't want it.
Pharmaceutical corporations. And that's what counts as political support. Doesn't matter if the public's 90% in favor. And we know that they're very harmful. I mean, there's a reason, after all, why the U.S. has the most inefficient healthcare system in the industrial world. I mean, about twice the per capita cost of similar societies and some of the worst outcomes in the industrial world. Main reason is it's privatized, which introduces layer after layer of bureaucracy, of supervision, of commercials, profit making, and so on. Huge amounts of paperwork. I mean, all of that costs a lot of money, and it makes healthcare just out of reach for a lot of people. Plenty of people just put off necessary healthcare because they can't afford it, and it's going way up. It's increasing very fast. Well, public is opposed, but in a society that's corporate dominated, and with the media just being part of it, it doesn't matter. The public's voice is not heard, can't enter. So I think, yes, this point might be. In fact, you might ask another question about commercials altogether. Why are there commercials on television altogether? If you take an economics course, they'll tell you that we have a market system, and a market is based on informed consumers making rational choices. Then you study rational choice theory and proof theorems and so on. Well, you've looked at television ads.
Right.
I mean, when you look at a television ad, is the ad trying to make you an informed consumer who's going to make a rational choice? I mean, everybody knows that's complete garbage. The purpose of the commercial is to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices,
Exactly.
including for health care. So, like General Motors doesn't put up a notice saying, here are the cars we're going to produce next year and here are their characteristics. Now, that would be a way to get informed consumers to make rational choices. And what they do is, show you some image of a car with a sexy actress or a football hero performing some unimaginable feat, climbing into the heaven or something like that. The point is to delude you with imagery and keep you uninformed and try to drive you towards consumption. It has nothing to do with markets. A business spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year to prevent markets from functioning. I mean, it's all something that everybody knows, but nevertheless, we repeat the mantra that it's a market society. Nothing like it. So why commercials altogether? In fact, there are corners of the society which do run like markets, and they don't have commercials. So take, say, the stock market. Like if you have 10 shares of, General Electric that you want to sell, you don't put up an ad on television, with a model or a football player holding the stocks and saying shares and saying, ask your broker if this is good for you, it's good for me, or something like that. What you do is you put them on the market, and they're sold at the market price.
Yeah.
That's a market. But that's just a tiny corner of the society. So I think you can ask what the comment that you heard is plausible, but we go further and ask why should there be HMOs in the first place, and why should there be commercials in the first place?
Right, absolutely. Professor Chomsky, I know there's been a lot of activity, political activity happening in the Americas, particularly lately in South America.
I'm sorry, could you talk a little louder?
I'm sorry, yeah, I have that problem. There's been a lot of political activity in which the United States government has been involved in the Americas, particularly South America. Do you believe that there's a relationship between the movement in South American nations like Venezuela and Bolivia to control, own, and benefit more from their own natural resources, and what we see now, the increasing hostility of the U.S. towards democratically elected leaders like Chavez and Morales? And do you think that the interests of multinational corporations are a driving force in that in the U.S.'s hostility?
Look, actually, the last interview I just had a couple of minutes ago was with a documentary on the overthrow of the parliamentary government of Iran in 1953, a military coup run by the U.S. and Britain. And the point of the coup was they overthrew the parliamentary government, last one in Iran, because it was trying to take control of its own resources.
Right.
And that's just unacceptable. Countries cannot take control of their resources. In fact, the New York Times had an editorial right after praising the military coup for throwing out the parliamentary government and saying that this should be an object lesson to governments that are going berserk with hysterical nationalism and trying to control their own resources. That they can't do that. They're our resources. Happen to be somewhere else, but they're our resources. If you look at, say, the Clinton doctrine, he's supposed to be the moderate. His doctrine explicitly was that the U.S. can make unilateral use of military power in order to protect key markets, resources, and investment opportunities. Yeah, sure, because they're ours. So we can do anything we want to keep them. Well, in Venezuela, from Venezuela down to Argentina, in fact, the continent is largely out of control for the first time in its history. And yes, it's trying to integrate to their mass popular movements. Bolivia just partially nationalized its gas resources. That was following the will of 95% of the population.
Right.
And Bolivia was bitterly condemned as authoritarian and dictatorial and populist and all these terrible things because the government followed the will of 95% of the population. Same with Chavez. Since Chavez years, support for the elected government has risen very sharply.
Mm-hmm.
It's now the highest in Latin America. And partly it's because, the first time the government's using the national resources, hasn't nationalized them, but it's using, they were already partially nationalized. It's been using them for the benefit of the general population.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, he's demonized and attacked and condemned, vilified. That's consistent. And it makes sense. If your assumption is we own the world and everyone else has to follow our orders, then disobedience has to be punished. I mean, your favorite mafia don can explain that.
Bolivia had a populist coup, if you will, about their water. As I saw in the movie, The Corporation, they talked about that. But that seems like it was a really...
it was powerful and important.
Yeah.
I mean, Bolivia is unlike the United States. It's a functioning democracy. I mean, when they have an election, people know what the issues are.
Mm-hmm.
There are mass popular movements engaged in it. They come out and vote on the issues. And in fact, they elected a candidate from their own ranks. It's dramatically different from here, where people don't know what the issues are and are mostly opposed to both parties and so on. But the water story was a major one, Cochabamba, where there was an effort by the World Bank to get the government to privatize water, which means selling it. It's called getting the prices right. You have to sell the water for what it's supposed to be worth, and the company that's selling it, it's connected with Bechtel, has to make a profit. That's called proper behavior. Well, there's a kind of a small footnote to that. If you do it, it means most people can't drink water, don't get water to drink.
Yeah.
Well,
or they can't eat food, or they can't send their kids to school.
Nothing, and they can't even get water because they can't pay the price.
Yeah.
I mean, in a decent society, you don't privatize air and make people buy it.
Right.
And you don't privatize water and make people buy it.
But they're doing that here.
Don't say it too out loud because they might.
They're trying to do it here, but in Bolivia, peasants in the hills just protested and violent. And the protests turned violent, not because they were violent, because the army came after them, people were killed and so on.
Well,
but they stuck to it, and they forced the corporations out of the country, and they forced the World Bank to back down because they were fighting for their rights.
Right.
And currently in Illinois, there's some conflict. They're trying to get rid of the German company who's privatized a lot of the towns and water in
well, this
cities.
is one of the main U.S. government, World Bank, IMF programs. Real drive is to privatize what they call services. Well, services is a term that means anything that a human being could be interested in. Water, energy, education, health, anything you could care about. Well, if services are privatized, that means democracy is reduced to a silly game.
Exactly.
There's nothing left in the political arena.
Right.
If everything is transferred into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, you can go to the polls. What are you voting on?
Yeah.
Everything's been turned, placed under totalitarian control. They claim that the reasons are efficiency, but I mean that's a bad joke. There's no evidence for that, and even if there were evidence, it would be outrageous because human rights and democracy outrank efficiency. But it doesn't even come up because there isn't any efficiency. This is just an effort to try to reduce the severe threat of democracy, which is hated by every power system, perfectly obviously.
Professor Chomsky?
I got to take off. There's somebody else waiting.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you, Professor Chomsky.
Okay, good to talk to you.
All right.
Sorry, it's got to be brief.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.